They're gonna get me.
Just when you thought that you've seen it all with the level of fraud that's being identified in Minnesota, you ain't seen nothing yet. That's the topic of today's story because this is breaking over the holiday time period where two of the largest fraudster states are now directly in the bullseye of the Department of Justice, the IRS, the Department of Treasury, and the FBI. Let's get to Minnesota first. Ilhan Omar has had a lot of explaining to do recently as to what she knew and when she knew it, specific to the Somali community in Minnesota and the fraud. Over $9 billion of fraud has been identified so far, and it's going up every week. In this instance, this clip is going to show you how the Somali community in Minnesota has cornered and made the perfect play for home health care fraud. And in this instance, this number is again early and not yet part of that $9 billion that's been identified by investigators.
Here in Minnesota, a local realtor reached out to me to tell me about another way that Somalians are scamming Minnesotans out of their taxpayer dollars. In her community alone, Somalians have bought up over 455 homes. They buy these homes, claiming they're turning these homes into home health care centers. She says the way we know Somalians have bought these homes is because all of a sudden, extremely nice cars start showing up. Mercedes, BMWs, the nicest cars are parked in the driveway. And she said, by law, the state will not come out and inspect these homes and make sure these homes even have clients living in these homes. She also said, as a realtor, she cannot disclose to people wanting to buy homes in this neighborhood that Somalians have bought that home and they're using that as a home health care center.
Just a quick interruption from the story. If you're an America First voter and you love President Trump, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. If you could also like this video or leave a comment down below, all of that goes a long way to telling the algorithm to boost us. Believe me, the liberals, the YouTube algorithm, and everybody that isn't America First is trying to suppress our voice again. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Now back to the story.
She said these homes can even take people in who've just been released from jail, and the neighborhood does not need to know about this. But she says many of these homes do not even have clients in them. But the state is writing them checks every month for the clients that the Somalians say are in these homes. And these Somalians are making millions of dollars off of these homes every year. The Somalians have figured out exactly the perfect plan as to how to scam Minnesota taxpayers out of their money. They are banking on this, making millions of dollars. And the government here in Minnesota is too lazy to go and check it out and to see if there's even clients living in these homes. The fraud in Minnesota.
She brings up a critical point. There's been over 200 whistleblowers just so far in Minnesota that have worked at both the state level and the city level in Minneapolis that have gone on record and filed whistleblower reports denoting the fraud that's taken place. They brought this information to Governor Tim Walz and AG Ellison, and they didn't do anything about it. This level of fraud is, again, at $9 billion. That's the largest fraud scheme that we've ever seen with public taxpayer funds. But it gets worse. The question starts to then have to be asked, how much of this Somali fraud money has made it back and offshore to terrorists in Somalia? Good question. I think Ilhan Omar, A.G. Ellis, and Tim Walz have some explaining to do. The level of fraud that we're now seeing in Minnesota is again record-breaking. This instance, this video I wanted to show you is just one layer of the onion, how the scam is going against not only Minnesota taxpayers, but the federal taxpayers. And incidentally, the very next step after these investigations have been now started is to start to withhold federal funds. That's where the Trump administration is going. That as these departments are under investigation, they are no longer eligible for federal funding. This is going to be a much bigger story going into 2026. Governor Tim Walz, Ilhan Omar, and A.G. Ellis will have a lot of explaining to do. But this is nothing because the fraud now that's coming to light in California is the likes that we've never even imagined, let alone seen. Right when you thought Minnesota was bad, Gavin Newsom, the potential candidate for the Democrat Party in 2028, will have even more explaining to do.
California Congressman Kevin Kiley, he is sounding the alarm in his home state, saying under Governor Gavin Newsom's leadership, it has become the, quote, fraud capital of America.
And we have team coverage. Our national correspondent, Alana Austin, is on Capitol Hill with more on the investigations into Tim Walz. But we start with correspondent Heather Myers, who has more on what is going on in California. A rainy day out there on the West Coast. Heather, what can you tell us?
Well, good afternoon to you, Katrina and Andrew. This latest report was issued by the state auditor, and that's a nonpartisan position.
It's a
That
key
state
point.
auditor now puts 8 state agencies on the high risk list of agencies to watch out for things like fraud and mismanagement as well as waste. Here's a look at that 92-page report. Newly added to the high risk list is California's food stamp program. If the state doesn't get the improper payments under control, it could cost an extra $2.5 billion. Also on there is the Department of Finance, which was tasked with giving out COVID relief funds. Critics say $32 billion of that was taken by fraudsters. Then there
Just let me pause this because I don't want us to get used to hearing numbers like this because these are numbers the likes that we have never seen with fraudulent claims at the state level. Just COVID relief funds alone in California are now under the microscope north of $32 billion. Gavin Newsom will have a lot of explaining to do for this. And this, as you'll see in the rest of the story, is just one subchapter of the 8 state agencies that are now under investigation by the independent auditor. $32 billion, though. And again, it's so important. Don't lose sight that these are California taxpayers and American taxpayer money that is going to criminals, is fraudulent, and should be all of the individuals that are behind this should be held accountable to the fullest extent of the law. Hint, hint, Pam Bondi. Hint, hint, Scott Bassett at the Department of Treasury and the IRS. And hint, hint, Kash Patel at the FBI. California is making Minnesota look like child's play.
are infrastructure issues like California's deteriorating dams and also the high-speed train that's already cost taxpayers $18 billion without a single section of track complete. Other reports cite $24 billion spent on the homeless issue that critics claim the state lost track of. More recently, there's a report that says California cell phone users paid a surcharge for years to upgrade the state's 911 system. Here's Congressman Kevin Kiley talking about what happened to that plan.
That after spending $650 million on that system, the state is totally scrapping it and starting over, completely wasted the money because the technology doesn't work. Mind you, we are very close to Silicon Valley in Sacramento, and yet the government can't figure out how to make basic technology perform.
This is embarrassing, and this is scary because the question now becomes, what other states are doing this as well? And I'm not just picking on blue states, but let's do that just for a minute. New York State, under Kathy Hochul, is this happening? I would venture to say that fraud is happening in every state. But these are egregious, and record-breaking examples. Again, I want to draw your attention to the numbers because we can't be inoculated and just kind of get numbed to these because it's astronomical. Right now, let's just, before we get into California, summarize Minnesota. $9+ billion and counting. Huge numbers. In California, $2.5 billion for just the food stamp program. $2.5 billion. COVID relief funds, $32 billion. High-speed rail that didn't even get even one section of rail completed, $18 billion. $24 billion with the homeless issue, and $650 million as it relates to the California cell phone surcharge that took place. All in all, what this adds up to is $76.5 billion or more in fraudulent spending in California, all under Gavin Newsom's watch. So the question needs to be asked in each one of these instances. Who knew and when did you know it? So with California and Gavin Newsom, when did you know that this level of fraud was taking place? I think any of us, just at a very cynical and a very elementary level, can say that he was more than aware, because this is widespread. It's almost across the 8 largest agencies in his budget that he has to sign off for every year. $76.5 billion is really astronomical, and there's nothing that he can say that where he can plead naivete or have an alibi. He has to be responsible. The buck needs to stop there. But the question now, pivoting over to Minnesota, is how much of the money that went through the foreign nationals and the fraud, right, the Somali community, in this instance, how much of that made it back to Somalia? How much of that money that was stolen, U.S. taxpayer money was stolen, made it back to the Somali terrorists, people that want bad things for all America? Again, the question has to be asked of Tim Walz, of A.G. Ellis, and of Ilhan Omar. What did you know and when did you know it? And more specifically, were you on the take itself? I don't know the answers to these questions, but all of them need to be put in front of a subpoena and a grand jury, because this level of fraud is the likes we've never seen. The last question I'll leave you with is this taking place in other blue states? For example, in Illinois under Governor Pritzker. For example, New York State under Kathy Hochul. Look up and down the coasts, and you're going to see many blue states that are very proud of their sanctuary cities and their NGO activity within each one of those sanctuary cities. What we know from the Doge efforts with Elon Musk is that where there's NGOs, there's high potential for fraud. This leaves us with more questions than answers as we close out 2025 and start 26. But what we do know is that the Trump administration, under the leadership of Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Scott Bassett, must make every one of these individuals accountable. This is what we all voted for in the landslide victory for Donald Trump. We need to put criminals behind bars, and we have to stop this moniker that the Democrats run under, where they're holier than thou, having us look one way, while the other way they're logging up claims, and fraudulent claims at that, north of almost now $100 billion that we know about. And this is the thing I want to leave you with. These are just the funds in the initial investigations in both California and Minnesota that we know about. How bad is this problem really? I would argue it's much worse than any of us can imagine. I'm curious what your thoughts are, though. Let me know in the comments down below. Is this bleeding over to other blue states? What would Gavin Newsom say to the $76 billion in fraud that's been identified so far? What about Ilhan Omar and the Somali community? Was she on the take? Did she have foreknowledge of this fraud? What about Tim Walz, Kathy Hochul, and Governor Pritzker? Is the fraud happening in Illinois, New York? I would argue there's fraud in every state. But the question becomes, is this a blue state thing? Is this a blue state fraudulent virus? I think it might just be. If you've yet to subscribe to America First Alerts, please do so. Believe me, the algorithm here at YouTube and the other social media sites that we post on are doing everything they can to silence the conservative voice. When you subscribe to our channel, you help us get through the algorithm a little bit more. Like this video, and again, if you've yet to do so, leave a comment down below. I want to be able to have you be part of this conversation as well. With that said, we'll see you in the next video.
Okay, let's go.